Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm joined by Ebony Nilsson, who is a research fellow in the Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences at Australian Catholic University. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Ebony.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure, and today we are talking about the story of Vladimir Mischenko. And apologies to the Russians out there. I've probably not done a great job pronouncing that, but he did change his name to Bill Marshall.
He did.
And this is a story that is related to the Petrov affair, although we're not going to talk about the specifics of the Petrov affair particularly. But it is worth noting, isn't it, that today, the day we're recording, which is the 3rd of April, is the anniversary of Petrov's defection, the 59th anniversary. So, 59th? Yes.
69th.
69th, whoops, yes. 69th, which is auspicious and, yes, interesting in and of itself. Although it wasn't for 10 days or so that Australians actually knew that he had defected.
Yes.
So, at the moment, we're all in the dark. What has happened? Anyway, Vladimir Mischenko, can you tell me who he was and why he's important?
Absolutely. So he was born in a little village in Siberia in the Russian Empire. It was a railway town, so relatively small. His father was the kind of parish priest for the town, but he'd been a military man before that. He'd been in war and had quite a traumatic time. They were quite a long lineage of military men, the Mischenkos, and his grandfather was quite a prominent general. But his father was, traumatized by being in war, so took up the priesthood instead. So Vladimir grows up in this little town as the son of the parish priest. But he's sent off to military school when he's old enough. He's decided he's going to follow his grandfather rather than his father. But then the Russian Revolution intervenes. And as a family who were kind of close to the Tsar because of the military service and a priest as well, it's not particularly wise at that point to stay in the newly communist Russia. They would have been targets of persecution. So they flee the new Soviet Union. He spends a little bit of time in Europe. Then he heads through Japan and China. He's kind of at 18 at this point and he's traveling a little bit. He winds up in Townsville.
Of all places. Wow.
Yes.
That would have been quite a rude shock after Siberia.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he works in the mines in far north Queensland for a while, is just kind of a labourer in various places, but he does pretty well for himself. He kind of works his way up, seems to have settled in quite well. He's there for about 8 years. But then, of course, the Great Depression hits. And at the height of the Depression, he finds that he's out of work. And this is tough times for most people, of course, most Australians. And a lot of people are out of work. But if your name is something like Vladimir Mischenko rather than Tom, John, it's even more difficult to find a job. So he starts looking elsewhere, starts looking overseas. And he gets a position with the Shanghai Municipal Police. And so he leaves for China in 1933.
How extraordinary. I mean, were they recruiting actively in Australia, the Shanghai Municipal Police, for anyone to come and assist or?
Not that I know of. So Shanghai at this point is a treaty port. So it's been kind of divided up into these international concessions by different powers. And the British are pretty dominant in the international concession and dominant in this police force. So there's certainly that kind of imperial connection between Britain and Australia. But so far as I know, there weren't actively recruiting in Townsville, to my knowledge.
So he's in Shanghai from 1933. How is he then getting involved in what he becomes well known for, to the extent he is well known, which is not very well known? How does he get involved with the spy industry, with espionage?
So Shanghai in the 1930s is really a hub for espionage. There is spying going on all over the place. Most famously, of course, there's Richard Sorga, who's one of the Soviet Union's most successful spies. He goes on to Japan, where he's really quite instrumental in giving information about Germany's plan to invade the Soviet Union. But in the 30s, he's still in Shanghai and he's running a Soviet espionage ring. So you have him. If you've read Ben McIntyre's really excellent book, Agent Sonia, you have Ursula Kuczynski, who is Agent Sonia. So she's operating there as well. But there's also Nazi spies, Japanese spies, British spies, American spies, basically anyone and everyone is doing espionage in Shanghai at this point, partly because it's a treaty port. It's a place of commerce. So you've got lots of people mingling. So the Shanghai Municipal Police does ordinary policing, does detective work and ordinary kind of public order things, but they also act as basically MI6's eyes and ears in the Far East. So they do a lot of espionage. So Vladimir Mischenko starts off as just a beat cop, probationary sergeant, but he is really quite good at police work, so he gets promoted. And eventually in 1936, they transfer him into the special branch, which is the part of the police force that does intelligence work.
And he had incredible language skills, didn't he? Which, of course, made him very, very useful when it comes to so many different spy rings and espionage activities going on. They've got the Japanese, the Germans, the Brits, the Americans, the Russians. So he was quite adept at working all those nationalities, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah, about 5 languages in total, I think, which is really quite useful, especially in intelligence work. Yeah. And in a city like Shanghai, which is at this point so cosmopolitan, lots of different languages being spoken. Yeah, absolutely.
Do we know what he actually did in this special branch for the Shanghai Municipal Police? Do we know what he focused on?
So he worked within the boarding house division, which sounds kind of bland and innocuous, but was actually quite useful in intelligence gathering. So the boarding houses were where any foreign visitors were staying when they came to Shanghai. So if you know the managers of all of the boarding houses and they're willing to tell you about what's happening under their roofs, then you've got a whole lot of information about, particularly about foreign visitors, about political radicals, and anything like that. So Mischenko manages quite a large section of the city, particularly, again, coming back to these language skills, because a lot of the boarding house owners were Russian. So he can go and speak to them in Russian, is able to kind of get on their level a bit more. They're more willing to be open with him to provide some information about what's happening. And yeah, he receives a bunch of commendations. Again, this kind of work seems to really suit him. I think he finds his niche in Shanghai.
Do you get a sense then that he's, in terms of loyalties, that he's on the side of the British or Australians, or is he a Russian through and through, but obviously pre-Soviet Russian?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to guess a little bit at this because I don't really have the information to tell me this. I think he probably saw himself as on the British side. He certainly tried to sign up for the British Army when the Second World War breaks out. And he tried to sign up in 1939, so before the Soviet Union's been invaded, right when it's just a moment that's just about Nazism. So I suspect he probably saw himself as having kind of British loyalties. He did really like it in Australia. And Australia at that point is, of course, very kind of British still. Yeah. But yeah, still always has this strong identity as a Russian as well. Yeah.
So what happens to him that leads him back to Australia? So obviously World War II hits in 1939. He's in Shanghai still. He fails to get into the British Army. What's happening to him?
So the British Army say, no, you can't join up. You're too important, basically, in Shanghai. Your skills are too specialised. You have to stay with the police. And he, unfortunately for him and for his wife and his young son at this point, had taken up naturalisation while he was in Australia. So he'd taken up Australian papers, which were at this point British papers.
Sure.
And the Japanese occupy Shanghai as they sweep down through China and start taking territory. And they start rounding up anyone who is British and interning them. So he actually would have been better off at this point if he had have still been technically a Russian or a stateless Russian, because they weren't interned, but because he has these British papers, he's put into an internment camp, as is his wife and his 5-year-old son, but they're put in separate camps. For much of the war, they're on opposite sides of the country. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the camps are quite traumatic. Vladimir is really quite instrumental in his camp because he's interned alongside the British and US Army personnel and intelligence personnel, and none of them speak Japanese, but he does. So he acts as the interpreter for all of the people in his camp. His wife, Vera, had, I think, a particularly bad time in the camp and goes on to have kind of ongoing psychiatric issues as a result. And of course, his 5-year-old son is kind of growing up in this camp environment, which is really tough. So it takes them a while to kind of get back on their feet after the war ends. But at this point, the Chinese Communist Revolution is starting. So the British are being kicked out of Shanghai. All the foreigners are. So there is no more municipal police force to be a part of. So the war ends. They've had all of their property confiscated. They've got not much money. There's no more police force, so they really don't have an option but to leave. So initially they go to Hong Kong, which is still a British territory at this point, and he gets another job in the police force. So he does that for a little while and they kind of get back on their feet. They're all malnourished after the camp, so it takes them a year or so to kind of be back to full health and normal life. His contract ends in Hong Kong, and that's when they decide that they're going to come back to Australia, where Vera and his small son had not been before, but Vladimir had enjoyed so much.
So they had met when he was in Shanghai.
Yes.
I see.
I think they may have known each other earlier than that. It might have been a bit of a reunion. The family there's a rumour about that basically. But yes, She had not been to Australia before.
Okay. So they find themselves back in Australia. Well, at least he's back in Australia. Do they go to Queensland or where do they end up?
No, straight to Sydney.
Straight to
this
Sydney.
time. Yep.
So Sydney is interesting. So this is the late 40s now, post-World War II. And Sydney has a reasonable Russian community, doesn't it? Can you tell me about that?
Yes. So there'd been Russians in Australia for quite some time. There's a wave of migration after the revolution, people fleeing that. But the really big wave of Russian migration happens after the Second World War, in this period, same period where Vladimir and his family are arriving. So these are particularly refugees from the war, people who've been taken from their homes to be forced labourers for the Nazis often, and have ended up outside of Russia or outside of Eastern Europe, and they don't want to go back. So they're resettled all over the world by the International Refugee Organisation. And Australia takes a really quite significant number of these refugees as part of this operation to kind of populate Australia. So the government looks at the birth rate and decides it's not high enough. There's still fear about invasion after the war. We need to get the population up, so we'll take some migrants as well as trying to push the birth rate up.
And what were these Russians in Sydney and elsewhere, what were they like in terms of their sympathies to their homeland?
So the vast majority of them are what we call white Russians.
Yeah.
So anti-communist. They're living outside of Russia because they don't like the Soviet government or they feel that it's not a place that they can live comfortably. But there are a small number who are still kind of sympathetic. And they range from people who are really quite pro-communist to people who just kind of love their homeland and aren't necessarily, they think that maybe the Soviets have a few things right. They like the education and the healthcare and that kind of thing. So in places like George Street in Sydney.
And this is in the CBD
in
Sydney.
Yeah, right near Central Station.
Yeah.
We get this funny situation where there are two Russian clubs, one on either side of the street, just about opposite each other. One is pro-communist and one is anti-communist.
Right.
And as you can imagine, in the early 50s, that could be quite tense.
Yep, I can imagine. Yeah. And so what does Vladimir Mischenko graduate? I guess what's he attracted to? Is it the pro-communist or the anti-communist? I mean, it's probably pretty obvious.
Yes, he certainly wasn't keen on communism.
Yeah.
When he comes back to Australia, he decides that he'll head towards the same kind of work that he had in Shanghai. So he maybe joins New South Wales Police Special Branch. I can't totally nail down that detail, but that would make sense as a way that he then graduated into the brand new security organisation that's just been established in 1948, ASIO.
So he's using his credentials, I presume, from the Shanghai Municipal Police, and one assumes he might have had some references from them that would have given him entree into New South Wales Police and then into the brand new ASIO.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Because it's quite a big leap of faith for ASIO to be employing this person who's just turned up. In 1947, I think he came back to Australia to employ him as one of their officers. But he changes his name around this time, doesn't he?
Yes,
he's no longer Vladimir.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the fact that ASIO had hired a Russian who'd been in the country for under 18 months had always been the most puzzling part of this story to me until I figured out the Shanghai history.
Right.
And then it started to make more sense because he has exactly the right kind of CV for what they're looking for.
Did you ever find any evidence of individuals who'd vouched for him?
No, because that would all be classified.
Right.
But he had some reference letters that were written when he was trying to get compensation out of the kind of Japanese internment situation. He was trying to get compensation and a bunch of people wrote him letters, very, very glowing recommendation letters from the Shanghai Council. So it certainly seems that he was well regarded and I imagine similar letters were part of his route into ASIO, definitely.
Yeah. Did he get the compensation?
To my knowledge, no. So he ends up in this really awful situation where he is not quite British, but the Australians are saying, well, he was working for the British. So effectively, the British should be the ones helping to get him compensated, and the British members of the police force are compensated. But yeah, Bill Marshall, as he is by the time he's fighting for this, kind of falls between the gaps of the two governments. And as far as I can tell, the file just kind of ends. But as far as I can tell, he never got compensated.
Was it very common for Russian immigrants, I guess immigrants more generally, to change their names so dramatically like that?
Yes.
In the 40s, 50s?
A lot of people just anglicised names to make them easier.
Yeah.
Marshall, I think, is a slightly different case because he really does change his name quite dramatically.
Yeah, Vladimir does not, is it a translation of William?
Can be, yes.
Can be.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Mischenko to Marshall.
Yes. Yeah. So he told the family that they were changing their names because of his experience in the 30s. So because he has come and then left and is coming back, he has this experience and thinks, no, as soon as they get here, basically they change their names. He thinks this is going to be a heap easier for us if we've changed our names to something which fits in more. So they changed their names by default almost immediately, and they picked Marshall, according to the family stories, because of the kind of military connotations of it, because of his family's history.
Interesting. And how's his accent then? If you met him, does he amend his accent a bit so he sounds more Australian or British, or is he Bill Marshall but with a heavy Russian accent?
I mean, I think he must have still had something of an accent. I would imagine it was a slightly blended one, having lived in so many cosmopolitan areas. Shanghai particularly, obviously, and had spent quite a bit of time in Australia, but certainly he has to have had a bit of an accent. He wouldn't have sounded like the other men at ASIO, that's for sure.
No. And this, of course, is a time when population of Australia was over 90% Australian born. So we were really, really, really very white Australians. So you're going to stand out if
Absolutely,
you're one of the less than 10% of people who is not Australian born, and not just not Australian born, you're not British born.
Yeah.
So how does he go at ASIO in the late 40s, early 50s? I mean, ASIO's new, so ASIO's working it out anyway, how it operates.
Yes, absolutely. And they're very much a fledgling operation at this point.
Yeah.
So their main reason for even existing at this point is to track down the source of document leaks into Soviet hands. So documents have been going from parts of the government to the Soviets, and they're trying to figure out who it is that's doing this espionage. So, of course, that necessitates quite a bit of surveillance of Russians and surveillance where they're not speaking English. And ASIO's kind of early honor role is very Anglo-Australian. They didn't have very many people who spoke Russian. So they've got these tapes upon tapes upon tapes of telephone tap material and of material from bugs, from electronic listening devices. And they need it translated. So this is when they go looking for someone who can do that work for them, and they find Bill Marshall.
Wow. So he really takes to this work as he's taken to his previous work pretty well, doesn't he? I mean, he's really, obviously he's translating, which is incredibly useful, but he's also out in the field trying to turn Soviet agents and Soviet embassy officials and the like, isn't he?
Yeah, so he starts off translating full-time and then obviously graduates at some point into fieldwork. So he has the first go at trying to trigger a Soviet defection. So in 1952, he boards a ship that's bound back to Russia, back to Soviet Russia, to try and get close to one of the guys from the Soviet embassy who's going home. So ASIO think that maybe this guy could be convinced to stay, to defect. And Bill Marshall's the one who's sent to see if he is maybe amenable. So they hang out on the ship as it goes from Adelaide to over to Fremantle. They play chess, which is a very, very Russian pastime. And they drink, and this is all ASIO's footing the bill. They talk about their families. Bill talks about how he has family in Russia, but how good it is living in Australia. And they don't get anywhere. He figures out pretty quickly that this guy isn't going to stay. He definitely wants to go home. But it's a really important moment because they had to pull together the operation at pretty short notice and had to set up all of the things which they would need 2 years later when Petrov does decide to defect. So it's their first go at setting up a safe house in case he says, yes, okay, I'll stay. Getting other agents in place around him so that they can protect him if he decides, yes, I'm going to switch sides. So although it didn't come off, it was a really important thing for ASIO to try.
So this was a failed attempt, but obviously an important, as you say, dry run. The Russian Social Club on George Street, which is sort of where all the communists hang out, is obviously a pretty good hunting ground for Bill Marshall, formerly known as Vladimir Mischenko, and other field officers of the newly formed ASIO. So what's his engagement like on a daily basis? Are you able to get a read on that through the files as much as you can, given a lot of them will be classified? Was he there drinking every night, engaging with the patrons? Was he building reputation just as a nice Russian migrant? Straightforward.
So the very short answer is that all of the files are classified.
Right.
So ASIO doesn't release anything on its officers.
Yeah.
So most of the information we have on Marshall's career at ASIO comes from the official histories which have been written, because the official historians were given access to all of this classified material.
David Horner's book
particularly,
on,
yeah, because he does the volume on the early 50s.
Yeah.
That said, I don't think he was in the Russian Social Club drinking. They had another operative in there and a migrant who was a paid informant called Michael Bielogusky. He's the one who kind of coaxes Petrov towards defection, and he's quite a difficult agent, but he's doing most of their surveillance in the social club. Whether Marshall would have been hanging out across the road trying to get information from the White Russians, it's possible. I would have thought it would have been a bit too complicated for him to associate with other Russians too closely because of his work. I think it would have been far more straightforward for him to spend certainly his social hours with other ASIO men.
Right.
And the like, yeah.
So he's not really then going to be deployed as someone to convert someone into defecting. He is going to do the sort of back end stuff. And
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mention Michael Bielogusky. Again, apologies for my pronunciation, which is no doubt quite defective. He is incredibly important, and he is a curious character in this whole Petrov affair, but also obviously how he helps Bill Marshall in the end.
Yes. So Bielogusky is a wartime refugee. So he escapes the Soviet Union then by taking the train all the way across to Japan. He says that he had a 1-carat diamond in his tube of toothpaste, and that's how he paid his way. Bielogusky told a lot of very, very large stories.
Right.
So the diamond is perhaps questionable. But he did have a pretty crazy journey. So he makes his way to Australia from there as a refugee. He completes his medical training at Sydney University, but he really seems to like the excitement and intrigue of working with security. So he works with the Commonwealth Investigation Service, which is a bit of a forerunner to ASIO. And then once ASIO is established, he actually tries to apply to be an officer like Bill Marshall, and they reject him. But they take him on as an informant because he has these connections at places like the Russian Social Club, which they think will be useful. And they set him in motion as an informant. And when he's introduced to Petrov, they think, okay, well, this could work.
I'm sure it is classified, but is there any indication why Bielogusky thought Petrov was open to defection? Is something he said or actions he took?
It's a couple of reasons. They focus on Petrov in part because they were pretty confident that he was running the intelligence operation for the Soviets in Australia. So he had a lot more mobility in Australia than the other diplomatic representatives. He's in Sydney a lot, which is relatively unusual. He was a good candidate for defection in part because he liked to drink. He was a little bit kind of unstable. He really liked picking up prostitutes in King's Cross. So you've got opportunities here in perhaps for blackmail, but there's also just this indication that, okay, this guy isn't kind of a cold clinical professional who's really ideologically committed. Potentially there's some cracks here that we can exploit and get him to change sides.
And potentially he likes his freedom and the lifestyle offered by the West,
Absolutely.
Which might not be available to him back in the Soviet Union. The level of surveillance of ASIO, even in its fledgling days, of this Russian community in and around George Street was pretty extreme, wasn't it? I mean, we're talking Cold War. The tensions are high. There's a lot of skepticism about the intentions of these migrants, whether they don't know them. Australians are welcoming them into the country, but how do you know who they're associated with? How do you really know what political views they have? So how did the Russians take this? They had their apartments tapped, didn't they? Phone conversations tapped. You didn't know whether someone was an informer or not. Bielogusky obviously was. I mean, it must have been quite a unnerving environment for them.
Yeah, definitely. There is an extent to which for some of them it was kind of business as usual. So these are people who've lived through often the 1930s in the Soviet Union, which is the height of kind of Stalinist terror, of purges of the NKVD, doing really, really very intense surveillance to a level which ASIO could only hope for. Then often they lived through the Second World War, lived under the Gestapo potentially, Nazi occupation. If they'd come via China, they've lived under Japanese occupation and all of the security policing that involves. So for a lot of them, the idea that you will come across informants, you will have to deal with that, and that potentially if you need to, you can do some informing, is somewhat natural. So I think there is an extent to which they engage with security services perhaps even more readily than Australians do. Australians certainly do as well, and they report things that they see and all of that kind of thing. But for some of them, this is how they expect life to operate.
So obviously there were some who were members of this Russian social club who were pro-Soviet communist Russians, but were they seeking to change Australia, do you think? Or in the main, they did agree with, as you said before, parts of the Soviet Union's program, and okay, they believed in communism over liberalism, but they also had a pretty good life in Australia despite the security surveillance.
Most of them I do not think are out to stage a revolution in Australia, no. I think for the majority of people here, this is a kind of pro-Soviet patriotism, basically. It's a love of a homeland, and it is specifically a homeland that's post-revolution. They believe in kind of what the Soviet Union has done since 1917, because they could have joined the group across the road if they believed in a different kind of Russia. But on the whole, they want to kind of improve people's perceptions of Soviet Russia, improve Australia's relationship with Soviet Russia, rather than actually staging any kind of uprising here. And very, very few of them were actually members of the Communist Party in Australia. Mostly they're kind of sitting on the edges of those kinds of politics, what ASIO would have called communist front groups, so peace councils, Australia-Russia kind of friendship societies. And some people in those organisations are communists. They have links to the Communist Party, but they're not generally out to start a revolution here.
Yeah. So in the end, it was really those people who were engaged in the stealing of documents and those types of activities, and then sending that information to the Soviet embassy and then on to, obviously, Moscow.
Yes, yeah.
So can you tell me about how Michael Bielogusky, he got Petrov to defect, because he was obviously the key player among others. How did he do it?
They become quite good friends, and I think it gets very messy after the defection and they kind of start to fall out, but I think the friendship was really quite genuine on a lot of fronts. I think Petrov was really lonely.
Yeah.
And they both like to go out on the town, to drink, to eat, do some soliciting potentially. So they, develop this friendship. Petrov begins to even stay at Bielogusky's apartment, which was a big no-no for Soviet representatives, particularly.
But he's able to get away with it because he's the sort of senior intel officer.
Essentially, yeah. And he starts to get worried that other members of the embassy are suspicious, are following him. Politics within the embassy were always kind of tight, tenuous. There's a lot of tension happening within the embassy, and in a lot of ways, that is what kind of pushes him over the edge. So as much as Bielogusky is coaxing him towards this and starts to very, very gently, when Petrov starts to make kind of anti-Soviet statements, starts to very gently talk about how Australia is a good place to live. But really it's events in the Soviet Union that push him to the edge. So he had been hired by a guy called Beria, who was in charge of the Soviet security services for a while, really, really nasty character. And he is eventually knocked off by Stalin. So in Soviet politics, that then means that anyone who had Beria as their patron is potentially in trouble.
Right.
So as soon as they get word that he's been moved on, the Petrovs start to get very worried that potentially they're about to be recalled. He is killed.
Executed.
Yes, executed. Yeah.
Well, moved on from this world.
Yes.
Yeah. To the other world.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So things for Petrov look pretty grim for the return to Moscow. So Bielogusky's offer and incitement is pretty attractive by this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. And whether there would have been negative consequences for him if he went back, there may not have been, but in that particular moment, things looked really dicey for them if they were recalled to Moscow.
How much was the Soviet embassy monitoring the Russian social club itself? Were they looking at what Bielogorski was doing, or because Petrov was there, they thought, oh, well, Petrov's got it in hand, don't worry about it?
So they're not really monitoring the social club. They do hang out there quite a bit. So it's not just Petrov. There's others from the embassy who also hang out there. They are trying to develop assets within the other side of the community. So they're more interested in keeping an eye on the White Russians, on what they're saying, and getting informants and agents in that community who can kind of subvert and sabotage those anti-Soviet efforts. But all of that said, no one they had stationed in Australia was particularly good at any of that. And they really don't make any inroads.
They didn't send the A-team to Canberra, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, like Petrov himself was a desk officer, basically. He's very, very good at that side of intelligence work, not so good at the forming relationships, particularly because a bunch of these guys don't have very good English. They're being required to go out in the community and make friends, and they're not necessarily that good at that. So in Petrov's case, I think it was a case of the wrong guy for the job.
Yeah, okay. So 69 years ago today, Petrov defects, and this is when Bill Marshall comes into play, isn't it, in a big way? So what did he do?
So as far as I can tell, he wasn't involved in the Petrov operation until that moment of defection.
Yeah.
But that's when he becomes absolutely essential. So he is waiting at the safe house that Petrov is taken to immediately after.
Do we know that where that
defecting?
is?
Not the immediate one, I don't think. There was a number of them, and one of the Sydney ones actually went up for sale a couple of years ago, but it was right on the harbour, and I think it went for about $7 million or something.
Right, so you decided not to buy it.
Yeah, I thought about it.
Passed up the opportunity.
But I don't think we know where this initial one was, because
Right.
there were a few.
Yeah.
But Bill Marshall is waiting there, ready to meet Petrov. Petrov's English is okay, but it's not amazing, right? So they need a translator on site to translate the documents which Petrov has brought with him, which become this huge political thing with the Royal Commission and Evatt and the split in the Labor Party and whatnot. So he's involved in translating the documents. He goes with Spry, who's the Director General of ASIO, to Canberra the next day with these documents and translates a bunch of them on the spot for Menzies, so that Menzies can get an idea of what they've got in this material from Petrov. And then Marshall spends the next number of months, potentially even out as far as a year, at the safe house working as an interpreter. So he is the guy who is sitting with Petrov through hours upon hours, both Petrovs, in fact, of debriefing interviews. And they're being asked to explain all of the really technical details of how Soviet intelligence works. And Marshall is the one who's helping them to get those words right and then translate them into English for ASIO.
And how long does this take him? I mean, is it months and months and months in these safe houses?
Yeah, so months of interviews leading up to the Royal Commission.
Yeah.
And then through the Royal Commission, they have to keep going back to ask more follow-up questions. So basically the Petrovs are being interviewed for a number of years quite solidly by ASIO, but also by representatives from MI5 and CIA, Swedish intelligence.
And is Bill Marshall the one who's in the room with them the whole time, or does he dip in and out? Is it clear?
Difficult to say. So the names of ASIO officers are always redacted in ASIO's records. Their identities are protected in perpetuity, not just within their lifetimes. So his name is always redacted, but knowing a bunch of the details, sometimes I can look at the redactions. There's a discussion between Blank and Petrov in the Russian language about such and such, and then Blank comes back and in a number of situations, I'm quite sure that is Marshall, but it's difficult to say with any certainty.
Mm. Do you know the toll it took on Bill Marshall being in, I mean, the stakes were really high, no doubt. ASIO would have been depending on him. The government would have been depending on him. The Australian people were absolutely transfixed by this case.
Yeah, absolutely. The safe house, I think, was a really tense environment. The Petrovs were not doing particularly well. They were trying to adjust to defection after Yevdokia defects as well. Then there's their marital relationship, which had always been difficult and only gets worse under all the kind of stresses of defection. So other officers who were working in the safe house talk about how they would have these huge, huge fights, the Petrovs, and they would have to calm them down. And They would walk out in the middle of interviews and not want to come back, and you'd have to go and kind of cajole them into returning and talking to the interviewers again. So I think it was a pretty tense situation. It was long hours trying to keep the Petrovs safe, but also keep them talking so that they can get the information that they need.
But he did it, which is amazing. How long does Marshall end up working for ASIO?
So he retires in 1975.
Okay.
It's a relatively long career.
Spends another 20 years working on ASIO issues then.
Yes.
After the Petrovs. So.
And his son Don goes on to quite a career with ASIO as well, so it becomes a bit of a family business.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's good. So Don, in the end, despite the very tricky time in the internment camps in Shanghai under the Japanese, he's okay though.
Yeah. So he was quite good friends with Paul Dibb, and he ran Dibb as a bit of an agent in the Soviet embassy in the 80s. And Paul talks about how Don had a stutter, which was to do with kind of the trauma he'd experienced as a child. But yeah, he goes on to be a really, really effective counter-espionage officer. He's caught up in the Murphy raids on ASIO in the 70s under the Whitlam government, but yeah, goes on to quite high positions in counter-espionage. And he's talked about as a guy who really understands the Russians in a way that not every counter-espionage officer does.
How difficult was it to research? I mean, obviously the answer is very, Bill Marshall, because you were basically dealing with documents that you can't get access to, and you're trying to create a picture of a life and a career that's so much is obscured.
Yeah, so it's quite difficult to research spies. It can also be quite difficult to research migrants because things get lost as they move. And in this case, you kind of have the double whammy of both of those things. So the short answer is quite difficult. I thankfully figured out the Shanghai connection right before I was about to go to the US for a research trip. And the Shanghai Municipal Police Archive, what's left of it, is in the US, in Washington, DC. So I was able to look through those records. Obviously, anything on the ASIO side is quite difficult to get information on. But I think the best example is probably I was looking into the Mischenko's military history in Russia prior to the revolution and really wasn't getting anywhere. It's obviously near on impossible to do archival research in Russia at the moment. So I'd got to the point of digging around like Russian military forums, because there's lots of kind of hobby historians in military history here and in Russia, which took me to some pretty sketchy corners of the Russian internet. I was getting pop-up ads for conscription, and that all freaked me out quite a bit. And I wasn't really getting anywhere. So I think I'd found a good candidate for potentially the guy who was his grandfather, but I wasn't sure. Mischenko is quite a common name in certain areas of Russia. Among Cossacks, it's almost like Smith.
Right.
Which makes it quite difficult.
Yes.
And
Vladimir is equally
an
extremely common first name.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it was I'd kind of had an idea of who this guy might have been, but it was all very sketchy. And then about 2 weeks ago, Marshall's granddaughter went through a bunch of things in her spare room for me and found Bill's grandfather's service records from the 1860s.
Wow.
So Bill Marshall has escaped the Russian Revolution, the Depression, internment in Shanghai where all of their property is taken, escapes the Communist Revolution in China, comes to Australia. He lost all of his property, but he managed to hold on to his grandfather's service records. And I haven't even had a chance to really go through and translate them yet, but I think the reason I'm telling you this is that there's a whole lot of luck involved in finding these fragments.
Yeah. And when people are cleaning out a drawer, what do they keep and what do they just go, oh, well, that looks
exactly
sort of old and dusty and I don't really know what it says. So chuck.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, well, you must have thought all your Christmases had come at once.
Oh, I think I squealed, yes.
Oh, well, so this story is not yet complete in a way. You've still got more to uncover. So I wanted to finish our discussion by coming back to Michael Bielogusky because he ends up actually approaching Robert Menzies, doesn't he, in 1955, so after the Petrov defection. And he thinks of himself, I think you describe him as like a Bond-like figure. I think he fancies that he might be the next 007 and wanting to get into ASIS, which of course at that stage was not outwardly recognised as an Australian intelligence agency, but it did exist back in 1955. So he wants to be posted overseas to be as an Australian James Bond, an international man of mystery and spy. But that doesn't seem to go so well for him, does it?
Yes, correct. Bielogusky has a bit of a tough time of it after the defection, actually. So his cover is blown, the Royal Commission. They call him as a witness, which he'd wanted the whole time. He writes in his diary just about obsessively about this idea of becoming Australia's most famous spy. So he's quite pleased when he is called, and he gives testimony, which was quite important to ASIO's case at the commission. But after that, things start to drop off for him. He's no longer useful to ASIO because everyone knows who he is.
Yeah.
He writes this tell-all memoir, which had been part of his plan all along to basically make big bucks. He tries to sell film rights in the US, and the story kind of just fades and people aren't interested anymore, which is when, as you said, he approaches Menzies asking for this role as an international spy. And he'd been so difficult all the way through and was not a trained intelligence officer that there was really no chance of that. So he ends up going to the UK, where he practices as a doctor again. He couldn't work as a doctor here because no one wanted to come near him because he was kind of known as a man of treachery and espionage.
Yeah.
But I think he gets a bit of a fresh start in the UK and lives out the rest of his life there.
Oh, okay. I mean, it is amazing to reflect on the fact that Bill Marshall, who would have gone through physically significant deprivation, he makes it to the age of 92.
Yeah.
And he only dies in 1996 in Sydney. I mean, that's quite incredible.
Yeah.
This was obviously an incredible man. And if he could have told his story, what a story it is. And we're very grateful that you've been able to uncover some of it. And long may that continue. Let's hope you can keep uncovering more and more interesting bits and pieces. Well, thank you so much, Ebony, for joining me today to talk about Bill Marshall and his involvement in the Petrov affair. Such an important period in Australia's history, both politically, internationally, and really the ramifications of that still, you feel, to this day throughout the way our intelligence services engage with the community, and deep-seated tensions between intel and politics and other aspects of our life. So it's been great to have you on Afternoon Light.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.